What my goal and objective was really with the show was that to first see, is there interest? Where can we go from here? How can we develop the show? Now it's like, okay, how do we further grow it? And so monetizing is the next, phase.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, podcaster. It's your host, Adam Adams. And today I've got Brittany Wilkins on. And fun fact, she's from a town where I've done some real estate investing. So I bet you if I told her the streets of my properties, she'd probably know exactly how to get there. Kind of fun. Brittany's got a podcast that talks about Black history. The podcast is called The Coin, and this is Black history on the other side. So let's talk about what is on the other side of the coin. Really, I wanted to invite her to the podcast because I want to have all different types of stories of different podcasts. And this was unique because I don't get a lot of people having podcasts like this. Usually it's just a business podcast and that's it. And so somebody's like, oh, I'm a coach, I'm a mentor, I want to make money this way. And I want to basically, hopefully at the end of this episode, show you that there are so many different types of podcasts out there. You could start a podcast about anything. And Brittany's super passionate about this subject. And it's something super interesting to me as well. So you'll find her bio down in the show notes. And if you want to go to The Coin, Black History on the Other Side, the podcast, that link is also in the show notes. Just scroll down. And any other social media that Brittany wanted you to connect with her on, that'll be in the show notes as well. Brittany, it's great to have you on the show. You and I met out here closer to where I am right now in Denver at a podcast movement.
Yes, it's great to see you again, Adam. It was great connecting with you at Podcast Movement. It's kind of one of my favorite events going to. It's just the network, the connections, and the engagements of meeting different people. So thank you for walking me onto your show today.
Thank you. This is going to be fun. I want to talk a little bit about why you started the show. And in your business, you make money because you're an engineer. Is that right? Or did you just used to do that?
Correct. By trade, I am an engineer who has worked in the corporate space in various industries. Then I decided to really challenge myself and kind of step out of engineering to really maximize my potential and see what other areas could I grow in. And that's what I decided to get into the podcasting space. I had the idea many, many years ago. It wasn't until 2019, then also too when the pandemic hit is when I really decided to go for it and launch it. And it's been an amazing journey so far, learning a lot about the podcast industry, and it's given me a platform to really shine a light on the hidden history of Black history.
I want to go into probably one or two things that you can think of that is the hidden history of Black history. I want to kind of just highlight that. So if you can think of one or two examples, and the purpose of that is because I probably have a listener who would be a perfect listener who definitely wants to hear. And so I'm wanting to kind of highlight that, shine a light on that just for you to be able to kind of sell your podcast. So we'll do that here right now. So Brittany, give us one or two examples.
Yeah, so let's start with traditionally what Black history has been. Black history, from my perspective, has been more about the events that transpired from the transatlantic slave trade. And so the Black history, all that's been ever known, or the narrative, is that Black history started in slavery. And it was something that I've learned in my early years in high school, which that perception was kind of put on me, where I had a teacher who told me that Black history did not exist, that a whole classroom full of African-American students didn't have a history or didn't have a cultural heritage. And that kind of stuck with me from high school. It wasn't until I got into college when I start meeting historians who start to really teach me about the real African history and Black history, and, got me into reading various aspects from ancient African history all the way to present day events. And so with my podcast, To Coin Black History on the Other Side, my mission is to change the narrative, to really bridge the gap between African American culture and Black history. And I do that by unveiling the hidden aspects of Black history. So, for example, if you were to listen to The Coin Black History on the Side, you would learn about how Africans were in the Americas prior to Christopher Columbus discovering America. That's one of the many aspects I talked about. I did a whole series on the book They Came Before Columbus. I also talk about, too, some of our influential leaders like Malcolm X and the many different things that people did not know about him, and really telling his story as well from a different side and perspective, how he took the pilgrimage to Mecca and it really opened his eyes into religion, not only his religion, but also to just about race in general.
Yeah. How do you decide on what content to do for your show? Like what order to put the content? You know, what things to do first? Is it all chronological or how do you decide? And then I'm going to ask you about monetizing later, but let's start with how do you decide to do what content and in what order? How do you decide what order to put them in?
Well, for one, there are many other Black history podcasts who talk about history. So what I've done is like in any industry, in any business, I've done a competitive assessment. I've really listened to other Black history podcasts and got, some in-depth perspective on the things that they talk about and a lot of the topics. And I decided to be a little bit different, go in a little bit of the opposite direction and talk about a lot of the things that they do not highlight in their podcast. But also, too, I look at key dates and events, and as well as working with my network of historians to really brainstorm on topics that we think would be beneficial that are traditionally not taught in many of the traditional educational spaces.
What do you mean when you say my network of historians? Like, do these people work for you, or how do you know them? How does that work? Is it all part of the podcast?
So my network of historians is more or less my community. These are historians who I've met throughout my life from back home, from Youngstown, Ohio, who have really poured into me and who have really taught me Black history. I used to attend Black history classes myself at a local community church in Youngstown, Ohio. And then I also attend virtual Black history classes as well. And so from learning from my community, our network of historians, they have recommended books, documentaries, and white papers that I should read into. And that's how I've kind of decided, based upon the things that I'm learning in the Black history space, I think this would be some good content to publish and put out for the podcast.
Nice. Hey, I want to highlight something that you mentioned. Now, I might not be quoting you directly, but paraphrasing at least. And I think it's something that the listener, regardless of what type of podcast that they have, something that they could focus on as well. And that was that, Brittany, you said, you listen to a lot of these other podcasts in your genre and, quote, I decided to be different. I wanted to do something different. I wanted a different approach. I wanted a different way of doing it. I want to stay there for a second. First and foremost, I'm hoping that listeners like listening and thinking, yeah, I should know what's out there, and I probably should draw my line in the sand, do my own thing, have my own way of doing this. What's the reason on your end why you wanted to kind of charter your own path over here? Was the other path not good enough, or what was the reason behind that?
Well, the other path of, what the current Black history landscape looks like today, it's really what's popular. Like in any other genre, many of the Black history podcasts talk about what's popular. They talk about the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and many of those things. And, the educational school system teaches a lot about those things as well. But there are also, too, a lot of topics that, when you look at our educational landscape, are being banned from Black history curriculum. And I really thought that where these topics are being prohibited, that my platform could showcase and bring to light many of these topics.
Okay, cool. And so Was it so that you stood out, or was it just like a passion? It sounds more like it's a passion of you wanting to highlight things that are getting overlooked or banned, in better words. Is it that, or is it the fact that if you have a podcast that's doing something different, you'll attract different eyes, you'll stand out amongst the crowd?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think it is my passion. My passion is that I serve underrepresented communities of color. And I believe, I've took it as my own obligation to really educate those in my community on issues that are impacting communities of color. And I think knowing our history is very important for any culture, for any race. You should know your history of your people. You should know where you come from, and you should not take what you're learning as face value. We should take it upon ourselves to really tap into our culture and to really learn the many different aspects of our history. But then also too, yes, when you talk, podcasting industry is what I've come to learn. There are a sea of podcasts. There are so many podcasts today. And so like any business or industry, you have to ask yourself, what is going to make me stand out in this industry? Of course, I can talk about many other topics. I can talk about business. I can talk about engineering. I can talk about pop culture. I can talk about Kim Kardashian and everything that's going in the entertainment space. But really, what value does that bring to me? I'm more about value in educating people, as knowledge is power, but also too, again, what really is going to separate me apart and kind of bring a different, and I don't really see the other Black History podcasts as competitors. I see us as complementary assets to each other, because Black history is so vast. There's many years of history that have, transpired. And I believe we each need to play a part in that.
Yeah, cool. I definitely got the answer of, how do you decide what content to do? Because there's a few things that you do about that. You have your team that kind of helps you, your friends around you. You see what's banned and you want to do something different. So that's how you decide what content to do. And how do you decide in what order to put that content? For example, like you could, on one hand, go start in the middle like others have. You could start at the very, very, very beginning, or you could jump around. How do you decide in what order to do all those episodes?
Well, just kind of really exploring, right? Seeing what people are really interested in. For example, I'll give you, so upcoming in October, we know it's an observed holiday of Christopher Columbus Day, Indigenous People Day. So right there, that was a prime opportunity for me to talk about how Africans were in the Americas prior to Christopher Columbus discovering America. So that was kind of looking at the dates of the calendar to see what key events have happened over the course of history and around the world, and then really deciding, okay, does this make sense to plug in the show for this? So upcoming in October, I will have an episode continuing to talk about Africans' presence in the Americas that will launch on Christopher Columbus Day.
Yeah, cool. It's a combination of different things and it's just you kind of getting deeper and deeper and exploring in different directions. And so it might jump around. We might go from 1916 to 1813.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Exactly. I like to diversify the history and whatnot, because like I said, that's really my mission, to talk about things from ancient Africa all the way to current events. And again, it's just what is currently going on in the world. Another big thing that's been going on in the Black history community is the discussion of reparations. There's been lots of talks around reparations. So I've done, podcast episodes around reparations and many of the things that are going on in the communities, as I felt it was good to kind of talk about those things and talk about why reparations is a subject of discussion in the Black community and our fight for reparations. So again, it just depends on kind of what I'm passionate about, what inspires me, and what I think would fit best. But again, I think with podcasting, it's all a learning experience, right? Because I too look at my metrics and I see, okay, what episodes are most popular? What are getting the most downloads? What am I getting some VOC, voice of the customer feedback on? And that's how I decide to continue to unfold the show.
I've never heard VOC before. I'm going to write it down right now. VOC. C, voice of the customer. And is that a term that I should have already known?
Well, particularly it's a term we use in the engineering world.
Oh, okay.
It's a voice of customer. That's how, when we launch our products in the engineering field, we get that voice of customer feedback back. How are we doing in the marketplace? What more would you like to see future product offerings from us? So that's where voice of customer comes from, is always listening to the voice of our customer and adapting our strategy and our product from there.
Okay, cool. Hey, so Brittany, I want to go, do you monetize the show right now or do you plan on monetizing the show?
Right now, I'm currently in the process of developing a strategy to monetize. Really, what my goal and objective was really with the show was that to first see, is there interest? Are people interested in learning about this non-popular Black history aspect? So really, like anything, I've kind of been in the pilot phase, just really trying to understand the podcast industry in general, trying to see how Black history fits into this creative space, continue to do a lot of market research to see, okay, where can we go from here? How can we develop the show? But then too, working on that third aspect, now that we've built, I think, a great foundation, we have a listening community. I've gotten some market research and some feedback back from customers. Now it's like, okay, how do we further grow it? And so monetizing is the next phase. I've done a little bit of exploration already. I also use social audio to promote and market my Black History initiative as well, where on the particular platform I'm using that I am earning some earnings from that.
Okay, cool. And so the monetizing is a big part. That's where you want to go. That's where you're planning to go. And I'm looking at the podcast and I'm looking at like season 2, episode 8 is, I think it looks, at least just from my side, it looks like a little over 2 months from the episode that came out beforehand. And there was a couple that came out on that day, and then it was over a month. So what's the cadence? What's the cadence, and how do you decide your cadence for publishing episodes?
Yeah, so with the cadence, history is a little bit different, especially since I go so in depth with the history. So overall, our goal is to publish 1 episode per month, but sometimes it will depend on the content and the research that I'm doing, while it may take a little bit longer because, when you're really dealing with history, it's, first analyzing, then it's the fact checking, and then it's putting that history content in such a way that people will be able to understand and grasp it.
One thing that I'm thinking is if I was ever going to listen to history, I think I'd like to hear it from an engineer. So like you being an engineer, that's pretty helpful, because I want to say this the right way, because the listener who isn't an engineer, they're going to be offended. They're going to be like, what the heck? But when it comes down to it, most humans have our own side of things. Most of us have our own assumptions, predetermined notions about something, about a subject, and even in some cases, just like an agenda. But the agenda doesn't come specifically from the details. The agenda comes from our heart, because human beings, for the most part, we act with our emotions. And I think it's interesting that some of the times when we listen to news, for example, the news is one of the best. And let's just talk about the news on the right, the news on the left. The news on the right is correct about everything and every detail, and they are passionate about it, and nothing else can be right. And the news on the left is right about everything, right about every detail. They're passionate about it, and nobody else can be right. And they don't do a lot of fact checking. They do enough fact checking to support just their side of the argument. And on your podcast, what I think is a beautiful thing is that you are an engineering mind. You are the person who cares about the details, and not like your agenda, not like, okay, I want to tell this story, so let's only look for the details that show that part of the story, but more what's really going on. And sometimes you're going to take a month in order to publish an episode, because you want to make sure that it's not just one-sided, but that it is true. And I like that. I think it's interesting. And I don't think everybody who puts out history thinks the way that you do. And your high school teacher might be a good example.
Absolutely. And because a lot of the reading material that I'm looking at is books itself, and that references a lot of resources as well, a lot of books or whatnot. So I just not take the author's word as face value. I also go into and look at the references that they are referencing in the books. And I say, okay, because again, I'm trying to get a deeper understanding, because mind you, is that my podcast that's going to be coming out this month, next week, is about vanished African civilizations. That is like 10,000 years of history that I've had to really look into and put that into a constructive way so people can be able to grasp that. And again, breaking that down, it takes, time as well.
That's pretty cool. What are you focused on with your podcast right now? Something, even if we've already spoken about it, like what's kind of the thing that's happening with your show and where you want to go with it?
What I'm really focused on the podcast right now is really continuing to show up in these non-traditional spaces, because when you think about Black history, a lot of people at the Podcast Movement Conference ask me, are you a professor? Do you teach in colleges? Do you go to schools to teach? And yes, I've done some speaking engagements, but obviously for me, it's about taking this beyond the walls of the classroom and really putting this history out there for the world. So beyond my podcast, like I said, really I'm focusing on is social audio, really going into the social audio space and doing talks and allowing for more live one-to-one interactions and engagement with people who are listening. So that's really what I'm kind of focused on, the branding, the marketing, and increasing that exposure beyond the podcast.
I was just thinking about something, and what it is you want to grow your message. I'm right. You do want to grow the message. You want to get it in front of the more people, right?
Absolutely.
And one of the things that some people were assuming or asking or hoping for might have been that you did a lot of speaking engagements and that they could have you do a speaking engagement for their group, their class, or whatever. I feel like if you did spend time doing some presentations when invited, or even looking for, what is it called? And I think you'd be good at this too. What is it? TED Talks. You could do like one of those TEDx talks and get on YouTube or whatever, and people that are already looking for those TED Talks could find your podcast. And I think that one way for you to grow is by getting on other people's platforms, other people's stages. So going to speak at that university, getting on stage at a TED Talk, doing more outreach on other people's podcasts like this, etc. If that were a focus, I think it would rapidly grow the brand of the podcast as well. So I think that could be a good way to grow it and monetize it as well.
Yes, and with the upcoming, Black History Month will be upcoming in February, and that's kind of, like I said, on the working roadmap for 2024. Is continue to do those speaking engagements, continue to, reach those different audiences, as well as I put out a couple YouTube webinars as well, because obviously the podcast is very audio basic, and I think people really connect with the visual. So hearing the audio with the visual, I've put out, a couple webinars as well on our YouTube channel to really kind of connect the dots for people and to bring really history to life visually.
That's pretty cool. And what have you learned ever since you started? So you've probably learned a ton, and some things are probably harder than you thought. Some things might actually be easier than you ever thought. That's what happened to me. I was like, podcasting sounds so crazy, so difficult. I'm like, this isn't that hard. And then other things that I was like, oh, all you got to do is this. And then it was like, okay, that's a lot more work than I expected. So I'd like to get your perspective. We'll take a quick break. But as soon as we get back, I want to get your perspective on what you made it the assumptions was easy but is hard, and what you made the assumptions that was difficult but might be easy. We'll be right back.
Hey, my friend, as you know, this episode is sponsored by my company, GrowYourShow.com. We want you to be able to have the best tools at your disposal without costing you a whole arm and a leg. So right now you can get a free list of vetted equipment that like mics, mixers, webcams, sound treatment, editing software, everything that you need. I created the whole PDF with direct purchase links just to save you time and money, to help it be more convenient for you. So this free PDF will help you skip all the guesswork. If it's on there, it's vetted and approved by yours truly. And if it's not on there, it's probably not worth the money. So go ahead and get yours at growyourshow.com/PDF. Let's get back into the show.
We're back with Brittany Wilkins from The Coin, Black History on the Other Side. And I wanted to find out from her what things she thought was going to be easy, but actually are a little harder, and which things seemed hard and overwhelming, but they're kind of easy. So what were any misconceptions you had when starting your podcast?
Well, when starting out the podcast, I thought it was hard because when you talk about podcasting, it's all about creators and being creative. And me being a traditional engineer, we are not known for our creativity. We're known to be more on the left side of the brain, more logical, more rational. So it was hard for me to really figure out, how do I put a podcast together from the creative aspect of it? But then I thought, this is analysis paralysis. I'm thinking too deep into it. I said, I'm going to approach podcasting like I approach engineering. How would an engineer do it? And that's how I was able to kind of put my show together. And one of the assumptions that I had, that I couldn't really start my own podcast because I don't have a full production team behind me. And I said, well, I need a team to start this. I can't put out a podcast without a team. So that was kind of a misconception I had. I don't know the exact number, but there are many solo podcasters who are researching, writing, scripting, producing their own shows. And I said to myself, I don't have to be great to start, but I have to start to become great. And during this, I will be able to teach myself a lot of things. I'll teach myself, what do I really enjoy about the podcast production process, and what do I really struggle with? And then what will I need help with and be able to hire that outside expertise for?
So who did you hire? Who was the first people that you put on board?
I'm still producing the podcast. By
right
myself,
now, it's solo.
Right now, it's still a solo journey, for me. Eventually, yes, I think I will like to improve the overall sound quality of the show and really, enhance it from an audio entertainment. So that will probably be working with, a sound engineer.
I wonder, because I just started thinking about this, and at first my brain went, what Brittany is doing is so important that I believe that it's more of like a movement than a podcast. It's more of like getting a lot of people behind something and them wanting to share it, them wanting to be a part of it. And it made me think of the things that I have done that were kind of a movement, not even as strong as this, not even as strong as your podcast. But when I had something that people could believe in, I got a lot of people willing to volunteer and volunteer a lot of time and attention and money. And I start thinking to myself, for your podcast, I wonder what would happen if you went back to your VOC, the voice of the customer, and when you were speaking with that person, then you could just ask them, hey, does anybody want to volunteer to support the podcast? I think maybe you could say, I think we could get more regular. Maybe we could do every week or every other week if we had some people editing the show, or if we had some people doing this one thing. Would you ever consider just offering to your community to be part of the podcast, to edit the show, to be on that team somehow? Absolutely.
And it's, like I said, discussions, that I've had with a couple people. Like I said, I'm getting some help with the podcast some ways, but not necessarily from the sound design perspective, but also too, what I've learned, that people are interested in potentially having my podcast join their network. So that is something that is still in the works, as nothing has been finalized as well. So like I said, if I decide, and that depends if I decide to stay independent or if I decide to join a network, that support will be there.
Yeah. Have you found a network that is in the same genre, or are the networks mostly like all types of podcasts? What have you seen so far?
The first network that I'm talking with, they deal with all genres of podcasts. And then the second network I'm dealing with, they do have some history podcasts, but not necessarily Black history.
Okay. And so that's just one of them. I wonder if you could do a Google search for, because I hadn't thought about this, because I never joined any networks of podcasts, I guess podcast networks. I have never joined one, and I know a lot of them. In fact, many podcast network people that organize them come to me and they ask me to put all of my clients on their podcast network. So I'm guessing that they're probably pretty easy to find with a quick Google search, like Black History Podcast Network. We might be able to find that. And so to the listener, if you have a podcast in a certain genre, you might be able to just go in and do a quick search to find others in your area. Brittany, is there anything else that you thought would be easy, but really is a challenge for your podcast?
I think more or less, a lot of podcasters struggle with the marketing and the branding side of it. But at first, I thought it was difficult. But then I was saying this is really not as difficult because all branding and marketing is just really telling a story. And that's exactly what I'm doing with my podcast and Black history. So it's just, again, when you talk about any movement or initiative, becoming comfortable enough to talk about your product in such a way that first that creates value and that gets people interested in joining. I know I was at the podcast movement. That's kind of the one common theme a lot of newer podcasters were kind of struggling with. But for me, it was really just kind of learning the fundamentals. So I think what's hard for me, I have to learn the fundamentals. And then from there, it becomes easy once I kind of grasp myself in the fundamentals. But everything else, like I said, has been easy thus far. I'm passionate about Black history, so it's easy for me to do the research with my engineering background. It's easy for me to kind of sit and analyze and break down, some of the complexities of the history. To me, all that stuff is easy.
Okay. What would you say if the listener is about to launch a podcast? I'm going to ask you two different questions.
Okay.
If they're about to launch, they've never had a show before in their life, and they're thinking, they're scared, they want to know what to do, some stuff's holding them back. What would the best advice you have for that person who's not even launched their show yet?
You got to get over imposter syndrome. I think many people are afraid of failure, and they kind of psych themselves out and talk themselves like, I'm not good enough yet. And just as, many of the industry professionals said at the podcast movement, when you're first starting off, it's not going to be as great. It's not going to be as good, but that's how you learn and grow. You don't learn and grow by sitting there thinking about it. You learn and grow by becoming it. And so I would advise just to get started, but really focus in on your why. Far too often I see many people jumping into podcasting because it's popular, but then they don't necessarily see the instant success, and they don't necessarily know where to take their show from the first couple episodes. And then they get into something called pod fade, where they never make it past 7 episodes. So you really have to focus in, what is my why? Am I talking about this just because it's popular, or am I talking about it just because I'm passionate and I know this is my why and I know this is my purpose and I should be talking about this? Yeah.
And what about, and that was good, by the way. I like that a lot. I like the part where you're talking about how we need to have many of us assume that there's going to be instant success, or we want instant success. We do it because we think it's popular, because we think other people are doing it, but we didn't ever start and begin with the end in mind. I think that it might be Stephen Covey. I think
yes,
7 Habits of Highly Effective.
Yes.
Yeah. Begin with the end in mind. Reverse engineer it first and foremost.
Yep.
All right. So I got another question. If the listener is somebody who has been doing this for a year or two, what would you say to that person?
If the listener has been doing this for a year or two?
Yeah, I guess I should rephrase the question a little bit better. My listener is a podcaster. In some cases, they've been doing it for a year or two. So they're kind of still new in the game and kind of still getting their voice. And in other cases, they're about to launch a show. So the first question I asked is, for the person who's doesn't yet have their podcast, what would you say to them? And I'm now wondering, what would you say to somebody who's had a podcast for a little while, but you still want to be able to support them and give them some value? What would you say to that type of person?
Well, I would say to the podcaster just now starting out is to master the habit of consistency. Consistent actions lead to consistent outcomes. That's what I would say to the beginning podcaster. For those podcasters who have still been doing this for about a year or two, I would say continue to commit to the process. Success does not come without the process. And although you may not see the results right now, really what I've learned and what was really re-emphasized at the podcast movement was that this is the long game. You have to be in it for the long game. And just to really, again, focus on not the right now. I think of what has kept me going on the days that I felt like, is anybody listening? Am I creating value? I think about my legacy and what I want my legacy to be. So think about the bigger picture here. There will be one day that somebody may discover your podcast and that you will help them in ways that you never would imagine. But if you don't continue, then that person who may need you or need your help and need your wisdom, they may never get it because you've decided that I don't see the results today, so therefore I'm not continuing tomorrow.
Awesome. So the podcast is The Coin, Black History on the Other Side, Brittany Wilkins, and I want you to go and check it out. If you like it and give a rating and review, feel free to let her know that you heard her here. But this is something that I think we want to support. We want to support a new narrative where we're talking about parts of history that not everybody's talking about, that in some cases have been banned. And so we learned a ton of cool things from Brittany about her podcast. Yes, about her style, her form, how she approaches it, being engineer by trade. And we talked about how does she decide what the content to do, how to put them in order, what she decides to do first, how she's currently monetizing and her goal of monetizing. She talked about how she decided to be different instead of just going with what's popular and, the 1960s civil rights movement. There's also a lot of other topics that are being banned. And that thing about VOC, voice of the customer, is something that I think you don't have to be an engineer to use. I think a podcaster needs to use the VOC, where we go and talk to our listener and find out what they like, what they don't like, what they want to hear, what they're looking for. I think that that's a powerful approach to learn from Brittany's engineering background and bring it to what we're doing here with our companies and with our podcast. Talked about things that were easy that she thought were going to be hard, and she didn't have a team, so she was held back and not doing it. But then she was like, all right, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And that quote, I don't have to be great to start, but I have to start in order to become great. Marketing and branding is just telling a story. And also talked about the advice to 3 different people. If you haven't launched yet, don't assume that it's going to be instant success. Find a way to map this out and not just have a couple of episodes. Don't do it just because it's popular. Do it because you're passionate about it. To somebody who's in the beginning of their stages, consistency is the name of the game. To that person who's been doing it a while, continue to commit to the process. Be in it for the long game. That was Brittany Wilkins. I will see you guys on the next episode.
By the way, one way to ensure that you don't miss out on great content that we're producing on a regular basis is to make sure you're subscribed to the show. You need to be subscribed or following the Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to it in order not to miss all of that. And before I let you go, I need to mention, because a lot of people are asking, do you help? Can you help me with this? And the answer is yes. My company actually does it. It's called Grow Your Show. And you can find that at growyourshow.com. Our clients, they call us the easy button for podcaster because they simply have to record their episode. And they know that every single thing else is done for them. We sweat the hard stuff so you can be the star of your show. And if you would like help to make sure that we're editing and publishing and promoting and doing your social media, it's all in one place. And I think it's pretty affordable. You'll have to take a look for yourself. Just go to growyourshow.com and check us out. And by the way, I'll see you on the next episode.